I'd like to share with you the 126th Psalm. These are verses appointed for this third week of Advent. Let me just share it with you. Hear these words. Receive them. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we rejoiced. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the water courses in the Negeb. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. Would you pray with me? Oh God, open us up to the hearing and the receiving of your holy word. Open us up. Help us to let it form us, to speak to us, to shape us, to guide us. And God, in these moments, I pray that you would speak through me and, if need be, in spite of me, so that your word would be heard. Amen. I've read this psalm before. I'm sure I have. But it speaks to me differently as I come across it again today. In part because, I'm something of a city boy, right? I mean, now, to be clear, I wasn't raised in a particularly large town, much less a city, but I have always found myself drawn to the hustle and bustle of more urban areas. And when I finally had the opportunity to live in them, most notably and for the longest time in New York, it felt like home very quickly. And I know that is partly why, when I was a student in seminary, my placements as a student were a bit different than the vast majority of others. And see, what I mean by that is, at Duke, seminary students are required to serve at least twice in what they call field education placements. It's opportunities to learn in the field, so to speak. And the majority of these placements are serving at rural churches in the North Carolina conferences of the United Methodist Church, supporting them, of course, and also offering experiences for seminarians who are learning and discerning their call to ministry. But for me, not so much rural, that is. My two placements actually were in Houston, where, among other things, I participated in developing a gang intervention program, and Washington, D.C., developing educational programs for advocacy and social justice from my office across the street from the Capitol building and next door to the Supreme Court. It was a nice office. It was the last time I'll have that view, I'm sure. Was it full of that learning and discernment that program exists to serve? Yeah, big time. But not so much the rural part. Which probably is why the culture shift of my first placement, which was serving a small rural church with several farmers making up the congregation, was such a shock. A new experience, to be sure, and that's even long before I begin to account for times like fixing fences or running down cattle that had gotten loose. These were very new experiences for me. And I learned so much from them, from that community that I became a part of and served as pastor. So much about so many things. about faith, about reliance on God, about running down loose cattle, and at least a little bit about farming. Now, to be clear, I am no farmer. I don't have anything near a green thumb. If there is the opposite of a green thumb, that's the shade that I have. In fact, I brought this to share with you. This is my latest attempt. This is what's left of yet another cutting of a jade plant. A jade plant that my grandmother grew for years and years. It's like this tall. It's crazy. It's huge. And yet my dad very generously continues to let me try again with another cutting. And yet again, I couldn't keep it going. Dad, I'm going to need another one sometime soon, I think. But as I read this psalm now, a psalm that is just filled with the images of farming, I feel like I have a new appreciation of the toil and the experience of farming from my experience serving that other church, and I recognize it in this psalm. I recognize that as this psalm offers joy, it also acknowledges that joy comes from growth. I've read this psalm before. I'm sure that I have, but it speaks to me differently as I come across it again after having served farmers. I notice that those in the psalm who go out are not simply looking for joy, but even in the midst of their tears are sowing so that they might reap the fields at a later time. That even those who are weeping are bearing seeds, bearing a faith that growth will come. That their toil will one day produce a harvest, bushels of wheat or bundles of fruit, sheaves of joy. To put it another way, do you want joy? Me too. But let's be clear, we can't just pick it up at the grocery store. It isn't something we can count on being delivered. Sometimes, and maybe always, the truest and deepest joy we receive is the joy we have toiled for. We also come to this psalm not just in Advent, but in 2020's Advent. 9 months into a global pandemic that has spread disease, fear, and disorder into our lives. Just earlier today, in a conversation with someone, I learned that she had lost her job and was now working 2 jobs. 2 jobs, while also trying to keep up with her children and her family, trying to find stability and joy in a time when everything seems turned upside down. For many of us, the weight of this season feels different this year, heavier. The distance we experience from one another, the upheaval of our lives, joy might feel very far away. And so, perhaps like never before, many of us come to this psalm recognizing what it is to go out weeping, to sow in tears, to pray with fervor, restore us, O Lord, like water rushing through a dry desert. I've read this psalm before, I'm sure I have, but it speaks differently to me as I come across it this December. And so we also note that while joy may come from toil, it's not the result of our toil. Stay with me. I'll try to explain what I mean here. We press on. Even in sorrow or frustration or tears, we press on and God enters in. God is the one that brings the waters into the desert of our lament, brings the harvest up from seeds planted with little more than faith. And through God's restoration, do we one day find that we will go out and then come home with shouts of joy, carrying the fruits of growth. The psalm calls us to remember that it is God who restores, God who is with us as we toil, God who brings the growth, and from God do we receive joy. We are called to be those who sow, to faithfully sow. And like those that the psalmist names, we do so in circumstances that are sometimes without promise. The weather is maybe a bit strange. The soil seems unfertile, the seeds unfamiliar. We don't know what to expect, but we're called out to those fields all the same. We're called to spread the seed with faith, and then God enters in. God brings growth and turns their tears to laughter and joy. Not because we're expert farmers, not because we worked with a particular diligence or harder than another, not because even we find growth through adversity. No, God enters in to restore because we are in need of restoration. God enters in and blesses our growth, our toil with joy because we're creatures in need and because God is God. And so even now, even today, even in the midst of turmoil or uncertainty or anxiety or frustration, God is at work. And the work of God is our restoration, a revival, a harvest of joy, peeking up out of the earth, sustaining us and reminding us of God's promises to us. And so we are called to press on, to continue, even to try again, to trust in the one who wants to bless our sowing, even when it's undertaken in tears. For we believe, we trust that God seeks to restore us and to bring us joy. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the watercourses in the Negeb. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. Amen.